NASA brought Scott Carpenter safely back from orbit. Then they lost him. Aurora 7 had survived the most dangerous phase of the Mercury mission. The fiery plunge through Earth's atmosphere was over. The main parachute had opened. The capsule struck the Atlantic Ocean exactly as every astronaut hoped it would. But when the recovery forces looked toward the planned splashdown area, there was nothing there. The ocean where Aurora 7 was supposed to be remained empty. Somewhere, far beyond the waiting ships, a small metal spacecraft floated alone. Inside it was Scott Carpenter, alive after circling Earth 3 times. Yet, for the people responsible for bringing him home, the mission had suddenly become something very different. No one watching the recovery could point to his exact location. For the public, the mystery seemed impossible. Spaceflight had succeeded. How could an astronaut disappear only after returning safely to Earth? The answer began not in space, but on the surface of the Atlantic. The recovery fleet had prepared for a carefully calculated landing. Every ship, every helicopter, every aircraft had been positioned around a predicted splashdown point. The system depended on Aurora 7 arriving where mathematics said it should. It did not. When the final landing coordinates were calculated, the capsule had come down more than 250 nautical miles beyond the planned recovery zone. Nearly 300 miles separated expectation from reality. On a map, the difference looked like a shifted dot. On the open Atlantic, it transformed a successful mission into a search across an enormous stretch of water. The empty recovery area became the first piece of evidence that something fundamental had changed. The spacecraft had completed reentry. The mission had not completed recovery. That distinction had rarely occupied the public imagination before Aurora 7. The obvious explanation seemed simple. Surely a spacecraft returning from orbit could always tell rescuers exactly where it had landed. The Mercury program itself appeared to support that assumption. Radar stations tracked the mission. Controllers monitored the flight. Recovery forces waited across the ocean. Yet the Atlantic exposed a limitation that spaceflight itself could not overcome. Aurora 7 landed so far beyond the recovery fleet that ordinary radio communication no longer worked as expected. The curvature of the Earth blocked direct line-of-sight signals between the distant capsule and the ships waiting in the planned recovery area. The spacecraft still existed. Scott Carpenter was still alive. But certainty had become incomplete. Some tracking information survived. Radar stations helped narrow the general landing area after reentry. The recovery system was not completely blind. Knowing the approximate region of a tiny capsule floating in the Atlantic, however, was very different from placing rescue personnel beside it. Aurora 7 remained almost invisible against thousands of square miles of ocean. The capsule itself had not changed. Only its surroundings had. Earlier, it had represented one of humanity's most advanced spacecraft. Now it was an 11-foot cone drifting on water that stretched to every horizon. Time quietly became another opponent. Every minute that passed made the search feel larger, while the capsule remained in exactly the same place, surrounded by open sea. The Atlantic was no longer simply where the mission ended. It had become the mission itself. Then another piece of evidence changed the search. An Air Force search aircraft flying over the widening search area spotted something below. Roughly 39 minutes after splashdown, the crew achieved the first visual confirmation of Aurora 7. For anyone following events from afar, the discovery sounded like the ending everyone had been waiting for. The missing spacecraft had been found. Except it had not yet been recovered. Finding a point on the ocean and reaching it were two entirely different challenges. The aircraft could confirm that Aurora 7 existed. It could not instantly place recovery crews beside Scott Carpenter. Distance still mattered. Time still mattered. The small capsule floating below remained isolated even after the search had succeeded. Pararescue personnel entered the water to reach the astronauts. Recovery operations continued to unfold across the ocean. Meanwhile, Aurora 7 waited, rocking gently with the waves. The recurring image returned once again. The spacecraft had survived orbit. It had survived re-entry. Now it simply floated, unchanged, while an increasingly complex recovery operation revolved around it. Hours passed. Scott Carpenter left the capsule and waited in a life raft beside it. The raft functioned as designed. The spacecraft remained stable in the water. Nothing in the documented evidence suggests an immediate struggle against sinking or sharks. The tension came from something far more ordinary. Rescuers still had to arrive. Nearly 3 hours after splashdown, recovery forces finally reached Carpenter and brought him aboard a helicopter. He was flown safely to the aircraft carrier, waiting far from the actual landing point. Only later was Aurora 7 itself recovered by a Navy destroyer. At last, the spacecraft that had vanished beyond the recovery zone became a physical object again, instead of a distant position on search maps. The investigation also produced an answer for how the mission had drifted so far beyond expectations. During retrofire, the spacecraft's attitude was misaligned by about 25 degrees in yaw. The braking rockets also fired several seconds late. Together, those factors pushed Aurora 7 much farther downrange than planned. The engineering explanation mattered, but it did not fully explain why the mission became unforgettable. The lasting lesson emerged only after the spacecraft reached Earth. Before Aurora 7, it was easy to imagine that surviving re-entry marked the successful conclusion of a Mercury flight. Aurora 7 demonstrated something different. Splashdown ended the journey through space. Recovery ended the mission. NASA revised recovery procedures and manual alignment checks for later Mercury flights, because the events surrounding Aurora 7 had exposed a weakness that only reality could reveal. The capsule itself never changed shape. It remained the same compact spacecraft that had carried Scott Carpenter safely around the planet. At the beginning, it represented the triumph of surviving orbital flight. In the middle, it became a nearly invisible object, drifting alone across an immense ocean, while an expanding search struggled to reach it. By the end, secured beside recovery crews, Aurora 7 represented something far less obvious than a successful spacecraft. It became the evidence that a mission returning from space is not complete when it reaches the ocean. It is complete only when both the astronaut and the spacecraft are finally brought home.